Well, what a year we've had. We've seen some changes in recent years, but this has been a thumper. I think 2016 will go down as one of the most tumultuous years in the sector that many of us remember, whether it be closing small power stations in South Australia or an announcement of the closure of a fairly small power station here in Victoria, whether it be ongoing debate about carbon policy, or my personal favourite was when South Australia had a crack at grabbing for itself that most Victorian of phrases, "one day in September." Look, CEDA's really fiercely proud of its reputation for running things on time, so I'm not going to say anything other than to introduce Tony Marxsen, who's held the role of non-executive director on the on the AEMO board since 2011. He was appointed chairman of that board in November 2015. He's also director of Marxsen Consulting and has led projects of national significance in powerline, bushfire interaction and powerline bushfire safety. Tony's work informed the recommendations of the Victorian Bushfires Royal Commission, and he played a leading role in shaping the recommendations of the Powerline Bushfire Safety Task Force. He continues to support powerline network safety both as an expert consultant and as chairman of IND Technology. Prior to those roles, Tony was a director on the board of Sustainability Victoria from 2008 to 2012, and he was a leading consultant at the Nous Group for close to a decade. So if you'd all please join me in welcoming Tony Marxsen.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Jeremy. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you in what has been a very intense couple of months. Australia's national transmission grid was progressively built over nearly half a century between the commissioning of the very first interconnector linking New South Wales with Victoria via the Snowy Mountains hydroelectricity scheme in 1959 and the commissioning of Basslink in 2006. We now have 8 interconnectors linking the 5 national electricity market regions. These were built to carry power from large concentrated power stations near major fuel sources to major load centres some hundreds of kilometres away. We can expect the grid 50 years from now must provide secure, reliable, affordable, zero-carbon supply in a profoundly different world. A lot of power generation will be dispersed over wide areas, including urban areas. Many customers will use intelligent automated systems to manage their demand in response to price signals in their tariffs or even in real time. New forms of energy storage will operate at national grid, neighbourhood and microgrid scale and in individual premises. Every element of the grid, then, and the connected equipment will offer remote digital control. In thinking today about electricity supply, we must bear in mind what sort of grid we will need for this new world. The grid we build today will still be there then. Today we're dealing with a grid in transition. It demands innovative solutions from independent system operators like AEMO, from market participants, policymakers, consumers and communities alike. I'll just see if this does the job. There we go. Designing the grid of the future must take into account 3 core goals: affordability, reliability/security, and Australia's commitments to emissions reduction. No one element can be considered in isolation. The pathway forward must seek to balance all 3. The challenge of achieving this 3-way balance has never been so clear or as daunting as it is today. I would like us all to keep these 3 crucial goals in front of mind today as I share our preliminary recommendations from the South Australian Black System event in September, insights from our 2016 National Transmission Network Development Plan, and finally touch briefly on what the grid may look like 50 years from now. Today, we have published our 3rd report on the events that led to the statewide blackout in South Australia. In summary, a severe storm came through the state on the 28th of September with tornadoes that destroyed transmission towers, resulting in a number of faults and related disturbances on the grid in just 87 seconds. Some generating units had embedded protection schemes, a previously unknown feature, which were set to ride through only a limited number of disturbances in a 2-minute interval. When that limit was reached, they cut their power output, transferring load onto the Hayward interconnector, which tripped when it exceeded its safety limits. Loss of generation plus loss of the import over the interconnector caused the state to go black. A sequence of events such as this involving multiple failures or trips occurs very rarely and is classified as non-credible in the National Electricity Market rules. Based on our initial static modelling, it seems likely the South Australian grid could have withstood the loss of all 3 power lines and the 4th that was damaged after the black system occurred. Now, static modelling looks at a possible scenario at a point in time, and we may do further dynamic modelling, but we still cannot predict what additional events might have affected the SA power grid beyond the time of the system black, as the storm front continued its progress through the state. Putting it in other words, while we may conclude in time that the blackout we saw was due solely to the 500 megawatt reduction in generation, we'll probably never be able to state with complete confidence that a later circumstance in the ongoing storm would not have produced a similar result. A review of history has revealed previous major South Australian supply disruptions with similar causes in 1999, 2004 and 2005. However, in those events, the generators that reduced output were coal and gas-fired. This time it was wind turbines. September was truly a technology-neutral blackout. In this third report, we outline where we believe we can take practical measures to first reduce the risk of separation of the South Australian region from the NEM, increase the likelihood that if separation occurs, a stable electrical supply network can be sustained in South Australia, improve performance of the system restart process should a black system occur, improve market and system operation during periods of market suspension, and address a range of other detailed technical and procedural issues highlighted by our investigations. We present 15 preliminary recommendations in today's report. They are grouped against the structure of all our reports in this event: pre-event, event, restoration, market suspension. We will work in collaboration with network owners, industry groups, market institutions and the South Australian jurisdiction in seeking to implement these recommendations. Let me very quickly run through the primary goal of each group of preliminary recommendations. Our pre-event recommendations focus on improving our assessment and response to warnings of extreme weather and the management of consequential risks to electricity supply. In our next and final report, we will look at recommendations on the complex and vexed issue of generator performance standards and improved information about the operation of embedded protection and control systems. Our event recommendations will go beyond current world practice in protection schemes to find ways to minimise the chance of grid separation, or should it happen, maximise the chances of successful formation of a stable island system in South Australia. We will also explore the risks created when credible grid faults occur in close proximity to collections of decentralised generators such as wind turbines and solar plants. Our recommendations on system restoration are particularly valuable. System restarts are extremely rare and they pose extreme challenges to system operators like AEMO. The last South Australian restoration from a black system was 36 years ago in 1980 after someone inadvertently turned off the gas to Torrens Island Power Station. The most recent ones in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania were all more than 50 years ago. They are rare and they reward very careful study. Our preliminary recommendations on restoration aim to improve the speed of restoration of supply while still managing the risk of a second black system, a risk that is always present during the delicate process of system restoration. Suspension for more than a week of a regional market is unprecedented in the history of the NEM, so this again is a unique learning opportunity. We found we needed better procedures to operate the power system during an extended market suspension. Manual approaches are fine for an hour or two, but can become almost unmanageable if used for days on end. Our preliminary recommendations will lead to increased automation of some specific market processes, as well as possible changes to the NEM rules. We expect that some of our findings will reveal the policy framework, market incentives and some other aspects of market operation which drive outcomes should also be addressed. We will actively contribute to the resolution of these matters, working in association with our stakeholders and in collaboration with the AEMC and Dr. Alan Finkel's review. We plan to release our final report into this event in March 2017. It will likely contain further recommendations on generator performance standards and the associated regulatory framework. I want to talk about two key components of network grid health. All grids rely on two vital functions to maintain safe, secure and reliable supply to consumers. Australia's national grid is no exception. These are frequency control and voltage control. Frequency control is critical to power system security, and AEMO is responsible for enabling sufficient frequency control ancillary services, called FCAS, to maintain frequency within prescribed standards. This task currently relies on services provided by synchronous generation, including an inherent inertial response to rapid frequency deviations that slow the rate of change of frequency. A way of looking at this is that large grid-connected generators spin at about 3,000 RPM. About the same speed of rotation of a four-cylinder engine in your car when you're driving at 110 kilometres an hour on the freeway. In fact, the whole grid spins at exactly the same speed in lockstep. The power lines are not spinning physically, obviously, but they are spinning electrically. They're like long spinning shafts connecting all those spinning machines so that everything on the grid spins as one, hence the term synchronous. I know this sounds weird, but it's the most valid way of describing what some engineers call the largest single machines on the planet, national power grids. Grid frequency is simply the speed at which every synchronous machine connected to the grid spins as one. It's very important that grid frequency stay very close to 50 Hz. Large rotating generators and motors are designed to operate at specific speeds. If the frequency moves away from 50 Hz, their speed moves away from their design speed. If it moves too far, truly horrible things start to happen, like turbines and pumps exploding or heavy metal shafts breaking. AEMO puts a lot of effort into keeping the grid frequency at 50 Hz, and if we can't keep it close enough to 50 Hz during an incident, we disconnect supply to avoid the risk of major long-term damage to connected equipment. Working very closely and cooperatively with South Australia's network service providers and generators, we got much of South Australia back on supply in hours. If the sort of damage I'm talking about had occurred, and it has elsewhere in the last 80 years, it would have been days, weeks or months before we could restore supply. Before the South Australian event, we had already commenced an assessment of the suitability of current frequency control mechanisms to deliver the power system's needs over the longer term. We have engaged international experts to provide input into these studies, and will publish the outcomes of this work over the course of the next 6 months. Secondly, voltage control. Control of the grid voltage within tight limits is necessary for the safety of all connected equipment and the safety of those people who use that equipment, and that means all of us. Grid voltage must also be managed carefully for the grid to remain stable. There are modes of grid instability that can occur when there is insufficient voltage control. These conditions are termed voltage collapse. This is one of AEMO's tasks, to make sure voltages remain within limits even when things go wrong on the grid. Of course, there are limits to what we can do. Now we know that we manage frequency and voltage to keep the grid healthy, let's look at the power system of the future, both 20 years from now and, stretching our vision, the features of our national power grid in 2066. There's been a lot of investment in intermittent generation, such as large-scale wind and solar PV. These are connected into the power system using inverter-based technologies. This form of generation is not synchronous, and it has a different operating behaviour to the traditional rotating machines. It required changes on how we manage power system security and very likely how we operate the market in the future. The wholesale electricity market in WA, which we also manage, is an isolated system. That, like South Australia, which is not an isolated system, has also seen this shift, with the take-up of solar power growing at 10% per annum among households and 25% for businesses. Minister Dr. Mike Nahan recently stated the economics behind renewables meant Western Australia could account for between 30 and 40% of the state's future power supply. However, he noted the need to have a secure supply across the system, regardless of the growing dependence on renewables. You'll notice the drivers produce a very different view of the grid. Focusing on the NEM for today's discussion, this diagram illustrates the distribution via fuel source capacity of generation in the NEM. NEM-wide coal and gas-fired generation makes up a large proportion of the overall mix. However, if we look at South Australia, wind capacity is now more than 30% of total capacity in the state, and if we add photovoltaics, renewables make up more than 45% of total capacity. This dramatic change in supply mix has not happened overnight. However, it has happened over a relatively short space of time. From approximately 2010, installed wind generation capacity has doubled, and rooftop photovoltaics has gone from marginal to a forecast 5,000 megawatts capacity by the end of this year. We're looking at a quantum shift in technology over a 6-year period. Here's the holistic picture for the NEM's consumption outlook. You can clearly see the factors driving down consumption from the grid, such as rooftop solar and the uptake of more energy-efficient appliances. What this illustrates is that customer demand is no longer the primary driver of network investment. Instead, investment in the future will be driven by those three considerations I outlined earlier: affordability, security and reliability, and lower emissions. We are already looking at a new era for transmission in the NEM. Network investment has historically been driven by the need to meet rising customer demand. Key investment drivers are now focusing more on power system security, such as the vital ability to maintain frequency and voltage control, as I've mentioned earlier, and the need to connect more than 20 gigawatts of new large-scale renewable generation required to meet Australia's emissions targets. Our National Transmission Network Development Plan, the NTNDP, published today, suggests the next 20 years will be characterised by unprecedented transformation in the power industry as it transitions to a low-carbon future. Sufficient inertia, that is frequency resilience, is projected to be available over the next 20 years to maintain a secure and reliable supply, but only if the network remains interconnected during and following disturbances. Following a synchronous separation event, South Australia is at risk of widespread outages unless mitigation measures are put in place. System strength, that is voltage resilience, is projected to materially decline across the NEM, particularly in areas of high inverter-connected generation, such as much of South Australia, Western Victoria and northern Tasmania. There are also emerging local areas of poor network strength in New South Wales and Queensland, where high concentrations of renewables are anticipated by 2035-36. To counteract the decline in system strength, improvements to either inverter-connected devices or addition of supporting plant will become essential for these systems to operate reliably and securely. What is the future for transmission interconnectors in this new world? AEMO's assessment of options for national transmission grid development finds potential value in developing a more interconnected national electricity market over the next 20 years to remove network congestion, lower the overall cost of generation dispatched to consumers, and improve the power system's resilience to unexpected events. While noting there may be many different combinations of strategies to meet future balancing requirements, AEMO's NTNDP modelling reveals positive net benefits for potential transmission developments to help facilitate the diversity of the future generation mix and to improve system resilience. Transmission networks, historically designed for transporting energy from traditional coal and gas generation centres, will be asked to support large-scale renewable generation and be increasingly needed for system support services such as frequency and voltage support to maintain a reliable supply. Coordination and contestability can maximise the benefits of transmission investments across the NEM and ultimately for consumers. Our modelling shows greater net benefits when multiple developments are combined, highlighting the benefits of a more interconnected NEM. In short, we're projecting that a more decentralised grid must be a more interconnected grid. The driver is not long-haul transport of energy alone, but energy transport combined with transport of security support services. And we have to connect a lot of renewable power generation in new locations. Our NTNDP indicates that RIT-Ts, this is the Regulatory Investment Test-Transmission, are warranted to further explore the interconnection and local network and non-network options I've mentioned earlier. AEMO would also strongly recommend that a national approach that delivers contestability of all major transmission investments be adopted to promote competition and ensure the cost of grid investments to electricity customers are minimised. There we go. I'm hopeful I'm on the right slide. Yep. We acknowledge transmission investment is costly and grid assets take time to plan and build, and we know that operational measures and alternatives such as distributed generation, energy storage and demand response technologies must have equal opportunity in the future grid. We expect their role to be major. These distributed energy resources, commonly called these days DER, can either shift time of use or reduce customer energy use in total. The manner in which they are managed will shape the future of the electricity market and fundamentally affects AEMO's core functions. Some parts of the NEM have very high levels of DER by global standards. We are at the frontier of learning about the challenge of managing an interconnected power system with high levels of DER. New DER markets are emerging, however, they're still at an embryonic stage. The Power of Choice program is a major project for the industry. It is forcing traditional distribution network businesses to move from a regulated monopoly to a competitive environment. More options in the market should provide more ways to not only lower costs for customers, but also add cost-effective, agile solutions to support the security of the broader grid. "50 years is enough time for the world to change a lot. Some of us can remember what 50 years ago was like. We just adopted this newfangled decimal currency. Holden had taken the absolutely radical step of fitting seatbelts to its cars as a standard feature, and the federal government had finally killed off the infamous White Australia policy. All of that was 50 years ago. It was a very different world. When we try to look forward 50 years, we expect the world will change just as much as it has in the last 50, and the national grid must change with it. The grid in 2066 will include smarter, faster control systems acting over longer distances, greatly increased real-time data flows to manage security, new methods to manage grid frequency resilience, and new methods to manage grid voltage resilience. 50 years from now, grid control systems can be expected to change almost beyond recognition. They will be smarter, faster, and extend over much longer distances. For a start, and we're already working to put this in place for South Australia, there will be over-frequency generation shedding schemes. The assumption that every bad event leads to a shortage of supply is already outdated. If South Australia is exporting power to Victoria because local demand is low and wind generation is high, and this happens on a lot of weekends, and the interconnection to Victoria is suddenly lost, there will be a local excess of generation, not a deficit. To get frequency back to 50 hertz, generation has to be shed to match demand, not the other way around. In 50 years' time, it is entirely likely that artificial intelligence software will be used to form fast, sophisticated judgments about the best action to take to preserve system security. It is impossible to predict what those algorithms might look like, but the likelihood of their emergence is plain to see when one looks back and compares today's practice with those of 50 years ago and pulls out one's iPhone to ask Siri what a future power grid will look like. And I can recommend it. It's actually a way of getting a very comprehensive answer. Grid operation relies on prediction of demand and supply a short time ahead, so action can be taken to ensure balance and preservation of grid frequency close to 50 hertz. Until now, customer demand could be predicted with confidence based on historical metering data flowing in from bulk supply points, possibly with adjustments for temperature predictions. Generators generally follow dispatch instructions pretty closely, so we have some confidence we know what will be needed 5 minutes ahead, an hour, or even 24 hours ahead. We have time to prepare for changes in the balance of supply and demand. The advent of renewable energy sources already challenges this approach. AEMO has invested millions now in wind and solar forecasting systems, but we still don't have all the data we need for these systems to achieve their goals. We have just given the go-ahead for a project to use satellite tracking of clouds to better predict local changes in solar output. We're also working to improve our access to data on the aggregate capacity of solar panels installed in any particular neighbourhood. Residential battery storage will soon make our challenge even greater. The data required is not just capacity, location and stored energy held in the battery, none of which we yet have, but also customer choices, customer behaviour. We want customers to make choices that allow them to make the most economic use of resources for their own financial benefit, but we don't yet have data that gives us confidence we can forecast their aggregated actions in order to preserve security of the grid while they are doing it. The rate of change of frequency in an event is critical. This is called Rockoff. A high Rockoff leads to system black, a lower Rockoff is manageable and at least most of the lights stay on and the rest can be quickly reconnected. Rockoff depends not only on supply-demand imbalance, it also depends on grid inertia. Inertia means frequency resilience. It cuts the rate of change of frequency when bad things happen. The opportunity we have is to more directly manage frequency resilience like we directly manage supply-demand balance today. We expect to shortly see new markets that incentivise investors to build new inertia into the grid to replace that being lost as big coal generators retire. Such markets could even pay owners of old coal plants to keep their generators spinning and connected, just not producing power, so they don't need a boiler or a mine, and they don't produce carbon emissions. Or investors might offer fast response battery storage, or even super fast response energy storage based on ultracapacitors. Even wind farms and solar plants can use software to simulate inertia to some extent, and certainly DC links, such as Murray Link and Direct Link between New South Wales and Queensland, can do the same. A market solution would be good, and we're collaborating with the AEMC to see if we can set one up. We want any arrangement we adopt to be technology neutral, so solutions can compete on their merits and customers get supply security at the lowest possible cost. I want to briefly, very briefly, talk about national gas forecasting. The title of this talk is System Security and Reliability, and while security deals with some of those technical things I've already talked about, reliability is very much about gas. Our National Gas Forecasting Report, published last week, examines a future pathway which projects new GPG, that's gas-powered generation capacity, after 2030 of only 1.1 gigawatts to meet maximum demand periods. The report provides insights into the complex interactions between gas and electricity and the need for coordinated, holistic approaches to cross industries and technologies. Looking holistically at East Coast gas demand, total gas consumption is set to double, driven by LNG exports and growth in gas-powered generation. Excluding gas-powered generation, domestic gas use is projected to decline, with growth from a rising population offset by a gas-to-electric appliance switching trend and declines in gas-intensive industry. Similar to the electricity industry, the uncertainties in the gas industry outweigh the definitive. While the outlook continues to be dominated by export demand, catapulting Australia to the world's second largest LNG exporter and the major supplier for East Asian markets, the 2016 National Gas Forecast Report also forecasts growing demand for gas-powered generation. This simply illustrates the reality that for at least most of the next 2 decades, if we want a secure, reliable, affordable supply of electricity, we need a secure, reliable, affordable supply of gas. With this outlook for gas demand comes great challenges for policymakers, infrastructure planners and asset operators. This graph illustrates the great variances in our gas demand forecast scenarios. All 6 scenarios are potentially viable. Uncertainty rules. Our central forecast is called a neutral scenario. We've added 2 other scenarios to illustrate the range of variation realistically possible. These are called the weak and strong scenarios. We have never before faced such a high level of uncertainty in our long-term planning forecasts for gas. No matter where in Australia we live, and no matter what sort of energy we use, these are interesting and uncertain times. Thank you.